Okay, our next presenter is Tracy Beeler, and she is going to be talking to us about the construction of wizard citizenship. So please welcome Tracy Beeler.
Hello. So, by the end of our time together here, I hope to give you sympathy for Dementors by talking about lobsters and convince you that magic wands are wicked. So, all in 20 minutes. It's indeed a tall order to recuperate the being that most embodies fear, despair, suicidal self-loathing in the wizarding world, which is where the lobsters come in. So, in his 2004 essay, Consider the Lobster, David Foster Wallace, in a move that Gourmet magazine no doubt came to regret, was asked to attend and report on the Maine Lobster Festival. And so while he was there, he was less interested in what the attendees were consuming, or rather he was more interested in what the attendees weren't considering about what they were consuming. He writes, "For practical purposes, everyone knows what a lobster is. As usual, though, there's much more to know than most of us care about. It's all a matter of where your interests are. So if your interests are, in this case, your own gustatory pleasure, then you, in an almost zero-sum game, won't be interested in the lobster's experience of being boiled alive. Similarly, if your interests are disciplining wizards, you won't consider the experience of the disciplinary instrument." That guy. By considering the Dementor in this way, I hope to not only learn more about and possibly sympathize with these shadowy creatures in the Potterverse, but also to learn more about the actual interests of the wizarding community that, I argue, exploits them. We are introduced to the Dementors first through the seemingly universal aversion that wizards hold for them. The plot of Prisoner of Azkaban is initiated by the unprecedented breakout of inmate Sirius Black, which prompts various wizards to begin to discuss the guards, Dementors, with Harry. The beings are entirely defined by their emotional effects on humans. They give Ernie Prang the collywobbles. The Minister of Magic shudders when he speaks of their anger. And even Dumbledore, the series champion of inclusivity and tolerance, quote, isn't fond of Dementors and, quote, would rather avoid them. So by the time we reach chapter 5, entitled The Dementor, both Harry and the reader have been primed to distrust and dislike these magical creatures. And indeed, their appearance doesn't encourage immediate fond feeling. The descriptions that amass over the course of the books focus primarily on 4 characteristics: the black cloak, hands that are described as clammy, glistening, slimy, and rotted, dead, and rotten looking; the creature's blindness, their empty sockets; and their breath, described as long, rattling, putrid; and their mouth, quote, a gaping, shapeless hole sucking the air with the sound of a death rattle. And of course, that breath is weaponized to suck the happy memories and finally the souls of escaped prisoners, leaving them in a zombie-like state. So, not great. But what distinguishes these creatures from some of the other fantastic beasts we encounter in the series? For example, hippogriffs. Another non-human magical creature introduced in Prisoner of Azkaban. They are similarly dangerous to humans. They sport deadly-looking talons and are proud and easily offended. But what saves them is precisely what damns the Dementors. They're beautiful when you got over the first shock. So maybe hippogriffs are a bit of a straw man or a straw horse eagle thing sort of argument. So let's compare Dementors to another non-human magical creature that is a little more intimidating and unattractive: Acromantulas, shown here with wizard for scale. Enormous spiders with a taste for human flesh, but not nearly as reviled by wizards as Dementors. In fact, Hagrid raised one and mourns one. And Dumbledore presumably just allows a colony of them to reside in the Forbidden Forest, yards from the school. However, they do mainly keep to themselves and have extremely valuable venom, so I suppose they get a pass as well. My final candidate for non-human magical being, just as bad as a Dementor, is another dark creature that also makes its first appearance in Prisoner, is explicitly antagonistic to wizards, and similarly preys upon human emotions, boggarts. No one knows the true appearance of a boggart, as its MO is to infiltrate the creepiest, darkest places in your own home and then transform into what you most fear upon sight. So, yikes, like that seems pretty bad. But still, they are not demonized in the wizarding world as intensely as Dementors. They're sort of treated like pesky household pests. So I'm anticipating the most apparent counter-argument here is that Dementors, unlike the similarly lethal Acromantulas or predatory boggarts, are explicitly aligned with Lord Voldemort, the series' big bad dark wizard. But perhaps the very role wizards have assigned them and the relationship between good wizards and Dementors reveals that the cost for Dementors to their human employers might be contributing to that allegiance with dark wizards. So let's take a look at the little we know about Dementors in their natural habitat, not as guards of Azkaban. And yes, he's wearing an apron that says "Kiss the Cook." Wow. Our best account comes from Defense Against the Dark Arts professor Remus Lupin in Harry's third year, and even he, himself a marginalized figure amongst wizards due to being a werewolf, gives a description laced with prejudice, but still illuminating. He explains, quote, "Dementors are among the foulest creatures that walk this earth. They infest the darkest, filthiest places. They glory in decay and despair. They drain peace, hope, and happiness out of the air around them." So again, I give you, like, not great. But let's imagine Dementors before they were employed by the Ministry to guard Azkaban. It seems they are attracted to death or decay, places where bad things have already happened. They seem more like scavengers than predators, regulating their own numbers and largely keeping to themselves. Of course, an encounter with one would be unpleasant, to put it mildly, but no more so than an Acromantula, a Grindylow, or a Redcap, another creature that delights in human death as it lives where blood has been shed. So, my point here is that Dementors are bad, they're dangerous for humans, but their badness, fostering negative emotions, killing, is shared by other creatures that aren't as reviled. That their badness, therefore, has been intentionally cultivated by wizards. An example of this intentional cultivation is their very name. It's unlikely that Dementor is how the creatures self-identify. Much like Tusken Raiders in the Star Wars universe, they have been called something that instills a negative and predatory connotation to the creature that bears it. Additionally, there are some textual clues that the wizards manipulate the living conditions of Dementors to ensure their maximum scariness and their maximum compliance. A hungry Dementor is obviously a more effective hunter or guard, and the Dementors guarding Hogwarts from the fugitive Sirius Black are, Lupin admits, starving, unable to resist swarming a Quidditch match. Similarly, outgoing Minister of Magic Cornelius Fudge informs the human Prime Minister and Half-Blood Prince that the unusually foggy weather is due to Dementors breeding, suggesting that before they abandon Azkaban to join Voldemort, an action that's called a revolt, by the way, wizards strictly governed and interfered with their capacity to mate. And though there seems to be a primitive means of communication cross-species, because Fudge can sense the Dementor's anger, and they seem able to inform Dumbledore of their searches on school grounds, they seem literally unable to understand the weight of the emotions they feed upon. Dumbledore warns the students, it is not in the nature of a Dementor to understand pleading or excuses. So though this contributes to their menace, it also somewhat excuses them from a malicious motive. They, like other creatures, feed on what they feed on. For us, lobsters. For them, emotions. It is wizards who have weaponized and instrumentalized this natural predilection to serve as corrections officers. When Voldemort returns, the wizards fighting him speculate that goblins might join the dark forces because they would promise them more rights than they enjoy under the regime of the Ministry. And so perhaps Dementors made that same decision to revolt, not because they are inherently evil, but because they are able to feed and mate naturally when not guarding the prison. So why them? Why not Acromantulas keeping prisoners from escaping? Howard explains that they don't care about concepts like guilt or innocence, so why pick Dementors to embody your criminal justice system? What is it about Dementors that serves the wizarding world's interests? And so I think that exploring that question takes us back to the first thing we discussed, which is the way they look. So, remember those hands that were rotted and dead and rotten looking? So I'd like to call your attention to that all-important hyphen in the last descriptor, because I think it's important to emphasize that Dementors are not dead, undead, ghosts, zombies, all of which appear in the Potterverse, but they look like they are. They are associated in the wizard's mind with death because they look like decaying human corpses, but they aren't. They happen to be humanoid, non-human magical creatures, and this, I think, is why they were weaponized as guards of wizarding discipline in particular. Dementors look like not just our worst fear, like a boggart, but they look like death, and they visit a type of emotional death on their victims. If Dementors didn't exist, the ministry would have to invent them for its own purposes, disciplining the wizarding citizenry with the threat of communal death, the expulsion from the wizarding community if laws are broken. And so to help me think through this, I looked at Sarah Ahmed's The Cultural Politics of Emotion, in which she argues that the logic of human emotions does not operate on an inside-out model, but rather an outside-in model. So here's what she means by that. In my model of the sociality of emotions, I suggest that emotions create the very effect of surfaces and boundaries that allow us to distinguish an inside and an outside in the first place. So emotions are not simply something I or we have. Rather, it is through emotions, or how we respond to objects and others, like Dementors, that surfaces and boundaries are made. The I and the we are shaped by, and even take the shape of, contact with others. So she's saying that emotions are not generated by one individual psyche, but construct the way we understand ourselves as individuals and communities in relation to an other. So for our purposes, Dementors operate in the wizarding world not only to literally confine certain bodies in prison, but also to serve as a hated and feared other against which wizards can define themselves. They are just human-looking enough to reflect what wizards insist they are not: sightless, soul-sucking fiends. In this social narrative, where Dementors are blind, wizards can see the difference between guilty and innocent, and therefore can police that distinction. Whereas Dementors take the soul, the wizarding community enriches and protects the individuality of each citizen. And whereas Dementors are undead fiends, wizards are rational, free, and above all else, human. But are they? The intensity with which wizards fear Dementors, according to Ahmed's argument, is revealing a deep anxiety that they might not be as different from them as it first appears. In her chapter on the organization of hate, Ahmed writes, "It is not simply that any body is hated. Particular histories of association are reopened in each encounter, such that some bodies are already encountered as more hateful than other bodies." Dementors. Histories are bound up with emotions precisely insofar as it is a question of what sticks, of what connections are lived as the most intense or intimate, as being closer to the skin. So what history is being constantly reenacted and reinscribed with wizard-Dementor interactions? I think it's the relationship between magical human beings and magical non-human beings, nicely represented in the statue of magical brethren. The wizarding institutional reality bolsters the fiction that wizards are rational, free, self-determined subjects because they are not uncivilized stargazers like centaurs, greedy and unreasonable workers like goblins, or subservient automatons like house elves, much less ungovernable brutes that giants, trolls, or werewolves who aren't allowed in the Brethren at all. This division actually is replicated in the Muggle world through the magical creatures figure line from the Noble Collection, which was released to celebrate the release of Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. So you get a Dementor as a magical beast. You also get a Hungarian horntail, a dragon, so again, kind of a species. Now we're starting to get a little more specific. There's Nagini, Hedwig, okay, a goblin, Dobby? Putting all of those characters together is suggesting there's something bestial that wizards don't share. And so what separates them is not humanoid features or the capacity to use language or the willingness to form communities, all of which those creatures do to different extents. It's one thing. It's a magic wand. So the pairing of a wizard with a wand is ritualized and mystified, and the rhetoric of exceptionality is invoked repeatedly with the wand choosing the wizards, and wizards not performing as well with wands with which they didn't share this bond. And so wizards come to fetishize their wands in a process almost akin to contemporary Western subjects' relationship with like their cell phone. Like Harry often reaches for his wand even in situations where it would be useless. He kind of feels for it under his robes and feels profoundly anxious and bereft when he is separated from it. So the legitimately magical applications of this object can mask its function as another disciplinary technology. When wands are weighed, as Harry's is when he visits the ministry for his trial, they produce a document identifying the wizard and his age. And even more ominously, the spell Priori Incantatem forces an echo of previous spells from the wand that casts them. So here it's in its more spectacular incantation between Voldemort and Harry, but it's also used in the more mundane investigation of Winky by Amos Diggory in the opening chapters of Goblet of Fire. The existence of this spell means that all spells are archived and available for review by another wizard due to the technology of this wand. So they serve a helpful purpose for a government that's trying to consolidate power and to spread a culture of surveillance. Those who carry a wand are members of the wizard citizenry proper, and those who don't are not only other, but less than. So this fiction, like all unjust power hierarchies, shows its seams repeatedly in the series through multiple goblin rebellions over not being able to carry a wand, and the liminal status of Hagrid, who sort of has a wand but then sort of doesn't at the same time. But the wand is nonetheless both a powerful enabler and limit on individual power. Magic can be done by humans without a wand, demonstrated in one case by the ability of children under the age of 11 to accidentally perform it. But magic is only organized, acceptable, evolved, rational, and human once a wand has been bestowed, marking the entrance of a human into this institutional reality that elevates their powers and disciplines their capacity for using them. They become a citizen wizard. So we can almost read the hyphen between the two as a magic wand, conjuring a hybrid identity that affirms and contains a wizard's humanity in contrast to non-human magical beings. Once you lose that hyphen, you lose that wand through lawbreaking, you belong to the Dementors and you become as a Dementor, dead in the eyes of the wizarding world. Thank you.